You hear the SWAT officer yelling out 18 seconds. I'll play it again here in a second so you can hear it. And the reason that he's probably doing that is to let everybody know that they've been on the objective for 18 seconds so that by the time they get to their breach point, which happens to be the rear door in this case, everybody knows that they've given it a reasonable amount of time and they don't need to do any more knocking or any more announcing. And at that point, they can just make entry.
Pull it out, pull it out. 18 seconds! 18 seconds!
Go! Side door! Side door! Go!
Now you'll notice that they're 40 seconds into making themselves known or announcing their presence by the time they get to the breach point and start making entry. The officer's body cam, which you're viewing, is the officer who places down the shield. He's also the officer who gets shot with a .357 Magnum just below his vest. And before I go any further, I do want to make two statements about him putting down the shield in case you stop watching this video at this point. And that is that two things are true. One, that if the officer would have had the shield, he'd still be alive. And two, because of the speed at which they're moving dynamically through this structure, the fact that this officer even ended up in the position that you're going to see him in really just came down to chance. Almost immediately as the #1 guy enters this room, he knows that there's a suspect behind these blue totes because you can hear the suspect saying, "Don't do it, don't do it." I believe that this officer, who's a sergeant who first enters this room, probably sidesteps to his right while continuing to focus on the suspect, and he actually gives up his back to this uncleared space behind him, which is this bathroom. This causes officer #2, who's the officer who gets shot here, to say, "I got your back, and step behind that officer while facing the bathroom. And so in this moment right here, they're actually standing back to back. One person is covering the suspect and one person is covering this bathroom directly behind the #1 officer.
Hey, I want your back. Don't do it. Show me your hands now. You got a gun. You got a gun.
While they're standing back to back or body armor to body armor, the sergeant, for whatever reason, says gun, 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 or he's got a gun. And that causes that sergeant to sidestep back to his left. Now, I don't know if he's trying to do this for a tactical reason, if he's trying to create an angle that he doesn't have on the right side, or if this is more of a physiological response of him identifying that the suspect has a gun. But nevertheless, when he says gun, 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 that #2 officer, the officer who gets shot and is facing the bathroom right now, actually turns around towards the threat.
Oh, you got a gun! You got
Which is obviously something that you would do in that situation. If you're standing there and you're looking at a, basically a cleared bathroom, or at least from what you can see is clear, and you hear somebody yelling that somebody has a gun, you're gonna give up what you're looking at to focus on the thing that you know is a threat. At this point here, both officers are now turned around facing the suspect, and I don't believe that they ever saw what the suspect was doing with the gun because the suspect is able to fire around before either of the officers are able to see that the gun is pointing at them. So the suspect was probably concealed behind the totes. He may have even fired through the totes themselves at the one officer, which causes both officers to engage. Both officers fired a total of 10 rounds, and they landed 7 of those 10 rounds, and 3 of those rounds actually exited the house in the vicinity of where officers were passing by a few seconds earlier, but where this officer is facing here.
Shots fired, shots fired.
And so this also drives home the point that if you're pulling the trigger at 0.15 splits indefinitely and you're shooting at a standing human target, there's a good chance that that target is no longer standing there and you will subsequently miss the rounds that you're firing. It is not humanly possible to shoot at this speed and stop shooting when you see something change or follow that target to the ground, because as I've demonstrated before, humans can get hit one time and be on the ground in 0.25, 0.35 seconds. And so if you continue to shoot at 0.15 splits where the suspect is, you are essentially still shooting where he was and not where he currently is, which is actually on the ground. The article said that the officer placed down the shield in favor of his rifle. So it wasn't that he couldn't fit through the breach point or there was some other tactical reason. It was pretty obvious to me that this officer believed that he has a tactical advantage when he has his rifle, which is the mentality of some people out there. You're gonna see this video again, or I'm gonna briefly talk about it again when I talk about the use of ballistic shields, but there's people out there who don't believe in ballistic shields at all. Then you have people who believe that a ballistic shield only buys you something up into the breach point, and so they ditch it at the breach point, and somehow don't believe that they could be faced with a similar situation inside a structure with the shield that they could be faced with walking up to a structure with that same shield. The reason that I said earlier in the video, this officer ended up in this room and shot by the suspect by chance, and he also happened to be the one with the shield, is because when you are moving dynamically, and when I say dynamic, I'm talking about just continuously clearing the structure without pause, the shield has a limited use case because you are entering into that first space with the shield, right? You are the point guy, but then when you get to the living area, if you go to the right and the rest of the team is moving to the left and that's where the hallway is, well, the team is not pausing and saying, hey, let's get the shield up here, let's work this next problem. That's, you know, one of the problems that you run in with utilizing a shield while clearing a structure dynamically. If you're moving in a more deliberate way, then you can enter that first space, send a limited amount of people into that first space, identify the next problem, and then maneuver the shield so that it's in the most advantageous position for you to deal with that next problem. I know you guys have heard me ask this question many times on this channel, but put it into a different context for you. If you're going to do a dynamic clearing and then the suspect starts shooting at you and then you're gonna egress out of the house and set up a perimeter, the question that I ask you guys to ask yourselves is, if you're gonna move to that position when the shooting starts, why not start from the more advantageous position? And likewise, if you're gonna conduct a dynamic clearing and then encounter somebody with a gun and then move to deliberate actions, why not just start with the deliberate actions to begin with? These officers entered this room as a one-man and a two-man, saw a potential threat behind this, you know, these totes here with another significant problem to have to deal with, which is, hey buddy, your back's exposed to this bathroom, I have to cover your back, now you have to deal with this problem by yourself. That officer did the right thing in that moment. These officers are inside this cluttered room where you can't establish positions of domination, you can't run your routes, you can't create an angle on where the bad guy is. If I had to just say two possible things that you could do in this situation if you happen to be here, is try to create that angle to the best way that you can. In this case, there's a tall bed. You can't just step over that bed, right? But maybe you could get further to the right through some of this rubble or whatever so that you can actually see, or egress out of that room and establish a position of domination at the threshold, which is what this sergeant does after the shooting happens. So they're engaged in a gunfight. His buddy goes down to his right. The officers shoot, the suspect goes down, and the additional officer that comes in support, right, as the third officer to the room, what do we see when he's approaching this room? Now we see the sergeant outside the threshold, still focused on the threat. And I would actually say that that's not what he should have done in this very unique situation here, because he has his buddy who's down and a potentially still active threat. And so you really have to get on top of that threat in that moment. If you're engaged in a gunfight and your buddy goes down, the priority is covering down on this suspect so we know he's down so that we can render medical aid. And if that means you have to jump up on the bed and hold an angle on that guy, then that's what you have to do. But instead, the sergeant egresses out of the room towards the threshold. And so again, I'll pose this question. If you're gonna move dynamically and then encounter a guy with a gun and then move to deliberate actions, why not just start with these deliberate actions? Remember the video that I played for you guys where the officers are making entry into this house? They are moving pretty quickly and they see a suspect coming down the kitchen with a gun. The officer backs out of the kitchen and starts using the threshold to his advantage. We're moving dynamically until we see a bad guy with a gun, and now we're moving to deliberate actions. The idea that you're gonna be able to take 50 seconds to get to a room where there's a suspect and that you will have any tactical advantage when you get to that room is a fallacy. It mostly exists when suspects weren't going to fight you anyways, regardless of how you handled this particular problem. If they had gotten to this room and the suspect was already down on his knees or, you know, had his hands up in the air and said, oh, I give up, they would say, wow, that was so effective. The way we hit this structure was so effective. Let's do it like this all the time. My understanding based off of what I've read is that this was a part of a bigger narcotics operation, but that they were actually at this residence, obviously related to narcotics, but serving an arrest warrant. And this is what it says. The suspect, a convicted offender with a rap sheet of past drug and other offenses, had not shown a history of violence, which factored into the initial risk assessment made on how to serve the arrest warrant. The operations leaders requested the tactical team's help with the home after seeing a car there prior day registered to an unrelated person known to law enforcement to have a violent criminal history. And so the mentality or the theory and the thought is that if there's a violent person in a house who has access to weapons, our best chances at success, nobody getting hurt and us getting this person into custody, is if we overwhelm this structure as quickly as possible, utilizing speed, surprise, and violence of action. But when we look at the risk assessment, it had not shown a history of violence, or the suspect had not shown a history of violence. And so why are we still utilizing that tactic if we think it's best suited for the situations in where somebody is potentially a significant threat? And the apparent justification is that a day prior, an unrelated person known to law enforcement to have a violent criminal history was there, right? Okay, well, it was there a day prior. Is the car still there? Is that an assessment that we can make on the target before we actually launch this thing on how to do this? I don't personally believe that when we announce ourselves for 40 seconds before making entry into an objective, we actually have the element of surprise. I don't personally believe that when it takes us 50 seconds to get to the last room where the suspect is, that would be considered fast or speed. I don't personally believe that at the end of the day, when you have just two officers entering a room, where even if they do get to their pods, that is violence of action. Because that's what people are leading other people to believe, that when you have at least two guys enter a room, or even four guys enter a room, doing it even correctly and getting into your pods, that is violence of action, that will discourage somebody who wants to fight you from actually fighting you. I realize that some of these videos can seem a little affront, and I hope that they're not coming off in a disingenuous way. I just think that it's really important that we objectively and clearly identify the risks associated with what we're doing. We compartmentalize the difference between necessary and unnecessary risk so that we can properly mitigate whatever threats that we might be presented with. Dynamic clearings or dynamic movements are an essential component to law enforcement. There is a time and a place where we need to be able to execute those movements, but the time and place where we need to execute those movements because we're taking a lot of unnecessary risk and now turning that into necessary risk because the mission says that it's required for us to do so, and that mission is typically hostage rescue or active shooter. Modern CQB principles were developed by special forces groups, and some special forces groups were stood up for this very purpose to conduct counterterrorism operations, to be available for counterterrorism operations. Those guys need to be ready to go anywhere in the world at any moment and get into that objective and then get out of that objective. When the Iraq and war in Afghanistan started, these counterterrorism operations, if you still want to call them counterterrorism operations, turned into direct action missions. So instead of just being available when there's a hostage taker scenario or when we have hostages, now we need to be available more frequently so that we can do these direct action missions and go after a high value target or whatever other mission sets that they have. And in those cases, in a lot of those cases, it's important that they get through an objective quickly because they're not just dealing with a single objective like we are in law enforcement or a single person in a house. They also have to deal with potential threats in their environment. The video that I covered that I need to do again, HK35 with the French commandos, they went after a high value target, they got that guy, and then they went after where they saw some Taliban members go into this house, and subsequently what happened is two of their guys went down, one guy was killed instantly and fell inside the room with two shooters with AKs, and they had to spend an hour on that objective fighting to get their guy out of that downed room, and subsequently the cause and effect of that was them being closed in on by other Taliban fighters. So that's a problem that they have to deal with overseas and decide, hey, is this an issue that we have to deal with And because it is a lot of the time, they have to get in there and get out, which is not something that we have to deal with in law enforcement. I do appreciate all your comments and all your interactions. If you guys want to help me continue to grow the channel and reach more people and get this information to the people who need it most, you can do that by liking this video, subscribing to the channel if you're not already, and leaving a comment down below.